Good evening, I'm Bob Lee, Fox 11. We've all heard the expression, he's under a lot of pressure right now, or she's really stressed out. Well, we've all been under pressure or stressed out at some point in our lives, even as children. Much of our stress, though, is often job-related. But none of what the average citizen feels is anything like the pressure our public safety officials feel in the routine performance of their jobs. Tonight, we're going to look specifically at law enforcement stress, although what you'll hear could easily and often does apply to stress among all of those working in public safety. Corrections officers, firefighters, dispatchers, EMS personnel, police families, and of course, police wives and police husbands. Other public safety professionals protect and serve, and so much of what you hear tonight will be of interest even to those of you who aren't specifically in law enforcement. But the phrase police stress has become a term that applies uniquely to a group of individuals who routinely deal not only with life and death, but also with the apprehension of criminals, a crazy criminal justice system, and with the ambivalence of average citizen toward those who have accepted the power and authority of the badge. This is a badge that can all too often become battered by the pressure cooker that is called law enforcement.
Police see the world differently than many other people have to, and they do that to be professional, to be effective, but also to survive the job.
The images and the sounds and the smells that officers in the street pick up and have to deal with can linger with them long after something is over and dealt with.
As a police officer, you never know on any given day who you're going to stop and who you're going to talk to. And you might very well run into someone that just killed somebody in another state, and here you are pulling them over for a red light or a traffic violation.
Because of the things that we get involved with on a day-to-day basis that we may not be ready for. You don't get to pick and choose what's going to happen to you that particular time of the day when you're working. So
we answer the 911 phone calls that come in for asking for police assistance, and you only have X amount of employees. You have numerous lines ringing. There's some calls you have to stay on the phone, and you hear the phones ringing in the background and a lot of commotion going on in the room, and just basically, for lack of a better term, getting hammered non-stop without a break.
It seems like issues that involve children seem to affect him the most. And so when he comes home from work and he's had a call where he's had to deal with small children, I think being that he has small children and seeing what kind of things these kids can be involved in, it hurts him, and he comes home and it affects him, and after a little while he'll come out and he'll just start telling me his stories.
I don't like getting spit on. I don't like getting punched. I don't like people ripping my shirt and kicking me and calling me pig when I'm trying to do my job, when I know I'm doing it for the right reasons. That's real difficult. Dealing with the criminal element that wants to kill you. And it's dealing with people that don't like you is probably what I like the least.
Police officers have one of the highest suicide rates in the nation, possibly the highest. They have a high divorce rate, about second in the nation. They're problem drinkers about twice as often as the general population. Now, these facts are warning signals for unseen problems that are not being handled. Researchers use suicide, divorce, and alcoholism rates as three key indexes of stress in a group of people. Clearly, police work is stressful. Police stress is not always unique nor obvious. Almost any single stressor in police work can be found in other occupations as well, but what is unique about law enforcement is that all the different stressors occur in one job. During the next hour, we'll talk more about this in an effort to help us all gain a better understanding about the pressures faced each workday by a police officer. Dr. Kevin Gilmartin is a principal in Gilmartin Harris & Associates, a behavioral sciences management consulting company specializing in law enforcement and public safety consultation. He spent 20 years in law enforcement in Tucson. Dr. Mary Wales North is the department psychologist with the Tucson Police Department Behavioral Sciences Unit. She works daily with police officers and their families.
Why is police stress different than the work-related pressure that many of us feel in our day-to-day jobs?
I think police officers and other public safety workers, paramedics, police officers, firefighters, ER nurses, are in a constant state where at any given moment they really don't know what's going to take place the next moment. So that requires them to be living their life in a preparatory state of anxiety where they have to view the world as potentially lethal, potentially hazardous. So every contact that a police officer has, they have to treat people with a sense of courtesy, a sense of dignity, yet at the same time, right behind that veneer of courtesy and decency, they have to be prepared to respond to a threat that could cost their life. And it's that switch, it's that capacity to see the world in such a vigilant manner that causes police officers to many times have a different perspective on the world that without training can cause them to suffer from stress reactions. It's not that the pressure itself is that much greater than many other professions. It's an all-encompassing worldview that the police officer has.
People are affected by what they have to deal with, as well as the pace of what they have to deal with. And so I think that the images and the sounds and the smells that officers in the street pick up and have to deal with can linger with them long after something is over and dealt with.
What makes the job tough? Now, you alluded to some things, but there's a lot more that goes into it, from lawyers to the media, all sorts of things that factor in from what you hear and what you observe at TPD. What do you think makes the job so tough?
Well, I've asked a lot of officers about that, and the things that they mention the most often, in fact, there is a number one. The number one most stressful thing that they have to deal with involves innocent victims, and that can be children, the elderly, disabled persons, primarily children. And having to deal with the death of a child or injury or neglect or abuse of a child is something that many officers have talked about to me as being the worst part of the job.
They're exposed to trauma. Most people aren't exposed to trauma on a regular basis. And the reactions that police officers have, that they typically have to trauma, are very normal reactions. It's often said that the police officers have normal reactions to abnormal situations.
It was a summer day in August. I was working the 2 to midnight shift. I had just come on duty. I was a patrol supervisor on the city south side at the time. I was in the office. It was 3 p.m., 3 in the afternoon. And I remember a call came out, a call of a drowning, and that the dispatcher said that the fire department was also en route, and the call was to a residence. And as we pulled down the street, I could see that fire engine 14 was already on scene. Now, they had only gotten there less than a minute prior to us arriving. And as I pulled the police car up and parked in front of the house, I saw the front door of the house open, and I saw 3 firemen coming out of the house, and one of them was carrying a 3.5-year-old little boy. The boy was limp, and he was unconscious. He wore nothing but underwear, underpants, and he had foam coming out of his mouth and his nose. And it immediately struck me that this little boy was dead. All I could think about was, this was my son. This is my baby they're working on. And I stood there, and I had tears in my eyes, and I was shaking. Well, I heard a police officer yell from inside the house, "There's another baby in the pool." And I went into a trance almost. It was like everything went in slow motion, and I got severe tunnel vision. And I must have took 3 steps, and I was in the backyard. And how I got there, I don't know. But when I got into the backyard, I could see the swimming pool. It was a built-in swimming pool. And I saw no baby in the water. But I saw some curled up vacuum hose on one end of the pool. And when I worked my way around to that side of the pool, there was another officer that beat me to it, but there was a little baby face down in the water in the vacuum hose. And the other officer pulled the baby out, and it was a baby wearing a diaper. He was 15 months old. And I immediately took that baby from the officer as though that baby was mine, because in my mind at this time, right now, that baby was mine. That was my son in the water. And that was my son out front. And I began giving the baby mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and it seemed like forever. And a paramedic finally had to pry that baby from my arms and rushed the baby out to the front. And the ambulance left within a few minutes, and there was 2 ambulances that eventually showed up and took both children away to the hospital. The sergeant that I had driven up there with was standing next to me in the street, and I actually had to lean against the police car because I could feel myself. I wasn't on the verge of collapse, but I was shaking, and I was upset over this. And he was standing next to me, and he put his arm around me, and he knew it was affecting me, and it was affecting the others that were on the scene as well. And he put his arm around me. He kind of gave me a hug, and I said, "Richie, I don't think I want to do this anymore." And he said, "Don't worry about it. I'll handle the scene. I'll cover it. You just relax." And I go, "No, Richie, you don't understand. I don't know if I could put this uniform on again if there's a chance that in this job I have to see this again."
How does the job change cops?
Well, the primary thing that we hear from people who come in and want to become a police officer is, "I want to help people. I want to make things better. I want to make the world a safer place." And so most of the people who come on board have an idea like that they want to make a difference in the world. Over the years, as these other stressors come in and the difficulty of the job, and then the constant pressure to get it exactly right. It isn't something that you try and do as right as you can. You're supposed to get it exactly right and make exactly the right decisions. These pressures, I believe, can turn a person into someone who's rather cynical. And part of the cynicism comes from working very hard to do the right thing and make arrests, but then because of the overloaded justice system, perhaps the person that you arrest for a crime that seems like a pretty bad crime will not ever go to justice, or it will take a long time. So there are a lot of things that interfere with that initial goal of making the world a better place from actually coming true.
I think officers, in order to survive on the job, have to have a different world view. They almost have to view the world like it's one big felony in progress, and they're driving through it. Most people don't have to view the world that way. The problem becomes they learn one perceptual set for seeing the world when they're at work. Then when they leave work, there's typically a sense of exhaustion, a sense of detachment, and they don't learn other perceptual sets. Now, some officers can balance this very effectively. They can see the world as a cop, they do effective work, then they go back to balanced, effective personal lives. But a lot of officers don't.
In a study of a selected group of Tucson police officers, author Stuart Gelman found that for each cop killed while on duty, 3 others commit suicide. Dozens more develop heart disease and ulcers, and 3 out of 4 are divorced. It happens, he says, because it's tough for cops to admit that they're human. There's no robo in front of the word cop. The officer on the beat is just like you and subject to the same frailties. Are police officers prepared for the emotional side of law enforcement? More on that coming up.
It took me a couple days to get over it, but eventually I did. I think about it all the time, but I don't hesitate to put the uniform on and go back out. And I would go again tomorrow if there was a drowning call. I'd be the first one on the scene.
Early in my career was when I went to a call of a small child that died of SIDS death. At the same time, I had 2 small children, and you start relating back and forth to your child or your family members at the same time you're trying to do your job.
There are periods of time where you can go 2 to 3 hours when we're extremely busy, understaffed. You don't get a break. Now, if it gets to the point where you have a particularly horrendous call, they, of course, are going to let you step out of the room to take a break because you're still a human being. We're dealing with people who are in true crisis, but sometimes it gets to you. The kid calls, or a child's been hurt, something particularly heinous, suicides, people who found family members dead.
Mentally, you come in really not knowing what's going on from the day one as you're a new recruit, a new police officer. Everybody sees the police shows on TV and how exciting it is, and until you get here mentally, I don't think you may never be prepared for some of the things you might see.
Well, we get called to people's houses during the holidays. It's not because we're there to celebrate with them, it's because there's a problem. And dealing with those problems as a police officer, you have to learn how to separate the job from when you get off and you go home and you have a personal life. And there is a lot of stress.
Law enforcement is a unique occupation. No other job puts you in almost constant contact with people in crisis. Yet police officers are expected to show extreme restraint under highly emotional circumstances. When a situation is out of control, cops are trained to act calm, to remain stoic, and to stay in control. They're taught to play a role that requires tremendous mental energy. When that mental energy wears off, the police officer's own human emotions can begin to take control.
Are we properly training cops for the kind of emotional experiences and the emotional changes that they're going to go through as they progress through their career?
I think they're trained to be very effective tactically. And I think that type of training is very effective. In the 1970s, we averaged 116 officers a year in the U.S. dying feloniously. It's down to about 65 officers a year dying to felony death. And that's directly related to the effectiveness of training, to the equipment, to the ballistic vests and better officer safety tactics. Whereas at the same time that we're losing about 65 officers a year in the U.S., the Police Suicide Foundation's research indicates we lose about 350 a year to suicide. So I'd have to say we're not training them adequately when our suicide ratio can be 2 to 3 times what the rate of officers dying to felony death is. As tragic as the World Trade Center loss to police officers is, there'll still be 6 times as many officers this year will kill themselves in the U.S. as were killed at the World Trade Center.
At the training academy, there is a lot of law to be learned. There is a lot of decision-making according to if this happens, then you do this, and if this, then that. And then there are situational experiences, I believe, that try and represent what the officer might come in contact with out on the street. And during this time at the academy, the officers are also being examined and watched to make sure that they're good prospects for working on the street.
When you go on a call, your job there is to do an investigation, and the best way to do that is to make sure that not to look at things in such a personal, where it's going to affect you personally. But there is a lot of training and a lot of people that have helped that mentally that you can reach out and touch and talk to and discuss. I think we have adequate mental training.
You're going to see things that the department can't prepare you for. They could tell you what you're going to see, but once you actually are there and you feel it and you smell it and you touch it, it's a whole different story, and you can't really predict how you're going to react to any given situation or how you're going to react afterwards.
When people are in crisis, the thing that I always try to remember, because sometimes the job can really get to you, and we're human beings, we have feelings like everybody else does, and families like everybody else does. We bleed the same way, we eat dinner, we do everything the same that they do, but when they know that we are 911, we lose that human element. So they are in crisis, and they will, because they don't have a better way to react to it, they will yell at you, scream at you, just basically walk all over you. You have to realize that these people are in crisis. Under normal circumstances, they would never treat you like that.
There's an unknown in almost every situation. I think it's a misnomer to even refer to a traffic stop as a routine traffic stop anymore. What about this risk factor that's so much a part of public safety and law enforcement?
Well, that's one of the dimensions that really has to be assessed effectively, because some people inappropriately seek out law enforcement as a career because they like risk. They're risk recreators. And you have to have people in law enforcement who can function in a high-risk environment, yet maintain rational thought. And that can be difficult on occasion, particularly the level of emotional strain and the intensity of the situations that some officers find themselves in. What people do when they're in a risk environment is their level of alertness elevates. They become quite perceptive of nuances and changes in their environment. Their level of awareness, hearing, interaction, reflexes increase. And that's a pretty pleasant sensation. So when a lot of cops are on duty, they feel pretty good about being on duty. It's an alive feeling. It's an alert feeling. The term I use is hypervigilant, and my work and writings on it. The problem with this is when officers go into this phase on duty of being hypervigilant, it makes them very effective officers, but that's every time going to be followed, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's going to be followed by a state of, when they leave the police role each day, a state of detachment, a state of isolation, a state of non-communicativeness. So the best police officers, without appropriate training, are really at risk to having damage in their personal life.
I understand that the two most dangerous types of call are a traffic stop and domestic violence, that those are the places that officer injury is the greatest. In terms of the danger of the job, it seems to me that even in the year that I've been in Tucson, the amount of violence, or perhaps it's just because I'm more aware of it, seems to have gone up. And we never know when a suspect is going to have an automatic weapon under a coat, for example.
We talk about officers having to make decisions instantaneously. It would seem that if you do that for a living, you might not be as inclined to want to do that in your off time, which I would imagine could make things challenging in a home environment.
The people that I have heard talk about that are people at communications, and that's where the dispatchers are, and the people who respond to the 911 calls. And I have heard them say that when they get off work and they are stopping for a Coke on the way home, they really and truly can't remember to decide what kind of Coke they want because they've just gotten so weary of the decision-making process.
And on every call that comes in, you make a decision which line to get, how to talk to them, what the problem is, how to deal with them, what level to make it, what questions to answer, how to enter the text in, what level, I mean, just it's constant decision making. So at the end of a long day, you walk out of there, you go to the grocery store, and the guy at the end of the counter looks at you and says, paper or plastic? And you blankly look at him and say, I don't know. And I thought I was the only person losing my mind, and then I found out everybody has that problem pretty much where I work.
It depends on what the day, what the day consisted of in the particular events. When we had some major cases we were working, sometimes you got home and we're still thinking about what was going on, what maybe we should have followed up on a certain day, or what we needed to do tomorrow.
I try not to think about the job. I try not to think about what I had just been through that day. It's hard to do sometimes because I have an 8-year-old little boy at home who wants to be a policeman. And the first thing he does when I walk through the door after he smiles at me is he grills me and he quizzes me what happened throughout the day, and I have to sit there and I have to go through just about everything I did that entire day to include whether or not I drove with the lights and siren on that day.
Officers certainly want to try to lead a normal off-duty life. We all want to have some sort of normal away-from-work life.
Right.
In the case of a police officer, by the virtue of the work that he or she does, their attempt to normalize may take on other dimensions and perhaps may involve something as radical as substance abuse, promiscuity, or other kinds of things. What do you hear about that?
Well, I hear the two peer counselors that I work with often giving the advice that people have to balance their lives in healthy ways. And so spending time with the family, taking up healthy pursuits like exercise or other kinds of sports, that balance is the key, but healthy balance.
When you look at major cases of corruption where agencies have lost control of large segments of their workforce and police departments, those are not officers that have balanced personal interactive lives. What they're talking about are officers who are 24/7 as police officers.
One of the things that I think the department does to address the burnout question is that people are moved. People can move in their jobs. So they don't have to do the same thing for 25 years. They can move into different areas. There are people who specialize in the detective work or investigative work or traffic. So there are a lot of different ways to vary your career. You don't have to do the same thing month in, month out.
As you've heard, there is much more to being a police officer than the training received at the academy or on the job. The cop must learn to look at everything around him as potentially threatening. Fortunately, fewer officers die as a result of felonies these days, thanks to improved equipment and better survival training. But officer-involved shootings do occur, and it's this threat that is perhaps the most critical of all. It affects not only the cop, but it also has a direct impact on family members as well. More on the ultimate crisis in just a moment.
Think about it all the time. In fact, I think about it just about every day I go to work, because that's how you survive. You have to be thinking, what would I do if?
What's the potentially most dangerous situation a law enforcement officer can encounter?
One that he's not ready for.
And although he grazed one in the hip, they continued running, and one of the shots hit my husband in the ankle. I think I got prepared when he was shot. I had to. Before that, I did. I would think about, well, what would happen if something like this? What would I do if this happened? And I had to deal with it, and we had to deal with it, and I feel better prepared now, I think.
If you're going to a bank robbery, you're expecting something to happen. You're expecting danger, and your awareness is much greater. If you're just doing a field interview, you're not expecting anything.
When I walk into this convenience store to buy a cup of coffee, what am I going to do if there's a guy in there holding a gun to the clerk's face? I think about it in a tactical sense. What am I going to do? How am I going to respond?
In talking about deadly force encounters, former police psychologist Dr. Alexis Artwall says police officers have become much better at physical survival over the past 25 years. Nonetheless, cops still say the first rule of police work is go home alive at the end of your shift. The psychological impact of a gunfight can have a major emotional impact on not only the officer involved, but on family members as well. Dr. Artwall is now a consultant and trainer and is co-author of the acclaimed book, Deadly Force Encounters.
One of the things that's totally unique about the job of a law enforcement officer, there are many jobs that are as stressful, many jobs that are as dangerous to the officer. However, there's one task that we require of a law enforcement officer that we don't ask of anybody else, which is they must, as part of their job requirement, take a human life when the situation calls for it. And not all police officers, even the ones that get through training, are really prepared to ask themselves and answer this question with an affirmative yes. So the training process early on should expose them to how will they feel about participating in this level of violence, being the recipient of deadly violence, as well as the perpetrator of deadly violence.
I can guarantee every time I walk into a bank, whether I'm on duty or off duty, I'm wondering if it's going to get robbed, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Now, in the emotional sense, I can't answer that question. I've never been in a shooting, and I don't know how I would respond emotionally afterwards. I'd like to think that I'd be back to work the next day and not bothered. But I can't say that because I haven't been involved.
I think there is some fear there. She does worry about it, but we discussed it, early on in our marriage of what I wanted to do and knew the dangers at the time.
How did you become aware that your husband had been shot?
His sergeant came in the middle of the night. It was about 1:30 at night, and the phone started ringing and ringing and ringing, and it was very scary because, as it is, I already have trouble falling asleep at night because he goes into work about between 7 and 9, and that night I remember having trouble falling asleep. I went to sleep about midnight, and then the phone starts ringing and ringing, and at the same time I hear somebody banging on the door, and I got up and answered the phone. They hung up and I looked out and I saw a police car, and I thought it was my husband. coming home for something, and then I saw his sergeant, and he just, when I opened the door, he just said, "Miss Galvan," and I said, "Yes," and he said, "I need to talk to you," and it just, he seemed to have a very, he had a smile on his face, and I think because he didn't want to scare me, and then again the phone started ringing, and his officer friends were trying to get a hold of me before the sergeant came to the house, but and he just told me that your husband's been shot, and it all felt like a dream. I felt like, you know, to this day when I think about it, I just think it felt like I was walking in a dream. And my parents found out before I did. They were right behind the sergeant. They got there to the house and took care of my kids and the sergeant, and I went and picked up my husband's parents and went to the hospital.
As a result of that incident, shots are fired, your husband's wounded. Has it changed the way you feel about your husband's job, especially each day as he leaves the house for another day at work as a police officer?
Yes, I feel, in a sense, I'm very proud. I'm so glad that he works for this department in particular, because one of the things that I've sensed is, and through all of this, his sergeant, his lieutenant, all of the people we've run into here at the police department were just so supportive, and they just did anything and everything they could do to help us get through everything. And to this day, they're still doing that. And I'm just really thankful that he's working here.
Now, certainly, while such an incident is taking place, it's chaotic. However, when it's over, the perpetrator is either dead or hauled away. The officer survived, or maybe wounded, but nonetheless survived to have a conversation with you and has a life afterwards. There can be chaos there.
Total chaos. Typically, the aftermath of an event is full of personal and administrative chaos for the officers. Many departments, especially some of the smaller ones that have not yet had a lot of shootings, aren't really fully prepared administratively to have a process that they go through that makes sense. Because as soon as the gun smoke clears, you're going to have the district attorney, union officials, all the brass in the police department, the officer's family members, all the different investigators, the investigators doing the criminal investigation, the investigators doing the internal affairs investigation. This huge crowd of people descend upon the officer in a hurricane of wants and demands. And unless all these people have gotten their act together and are working as a coordinated unit, you can get total chaos, which is typically what happens. So the officer really needs to be prepared for that, and hopefully as agencies become more experienced, these people can start working together so we don't have complete and utter chaos. And in some of the agencies that have made an effort to do this, the chaos is not as great, but typically it feels very chaotic to the officer. Also for the officer and his or her family members, quite often they are themselves in emotional chaos, especially if this is the first deadly force encounter for the officer. A lot of times they aren't fully prepared for the emotional impact this is really going to have on them.
I guess in a way, you know, I should probably feel more scared because of what happened, but in a way I don't. I feel because I know that they really watch out for each other. And I think in a way it has helped my husband to, because a lot of times he questioned what he did. And I think all officers do that, especially if they've been in a situation like this. And, I still worry every day when he goes to work.
The officer's family members also intellectually know someone may try to kill the person that I love. But until that actually happens, it's really hard for them to really understand the full emotional impact of what will happen to them. So there's often this drastic change in their view of the job and the world around them, especially depending on how the department and the criminal justice system and the public treats them in the aftermath.
We're very active with our church, and I think that helps us to deal with things that outside of the department. He tries not to take things home with him.
The vast majority of them are still at work. They're still effective officers. They've emotionally survived. And for many of them that have gotten good counseling and good peer support and good treatment from the agencies, once they and their family members get through the difficult adjustment period, which typically goes on for weeks and even months, sometimes years, once they've gone through this adjustment period, what does this really mean to us as a family, as a person, as an officer? They actually wind up being better than they were before.
It is clear that what happens at work has an impact on what happens at home when we talk about law enforcement. The stress in police work cannot be avoided, but there are some things that can be done to reduce it and to help cops have a normal life away from the job. And there's a role for you, the viewer, as well. We'll talk about emotional survival in just a moment.
99% of the people I interact with on a social level are law enforcement. It becomes an entity all on its own. And you understand each other, and you understand the shift work and the pressures, and you talk about it when you go out for drinks or to just get together. You end up isolating yourself from pretty much the rest of the world.
I was an assistant Little League coach last year for my 8-year-old's baseball team. I'm currently writing a book. It's fictional, has something to do with police, but it has nothing to do with police stress. I try to spend as much time as I can with my family and my children.
I enjoy running, so I run to relieve stress. I've also been very active in my family life with my 2 children and my wife. I've coached sports since they've been old enough to play, probably over the last 15 years, soccer, baseball, basketball. So I don't think about the job once I leave. I get myself involved in other activities.
When I first started with the job, I used to bring a lot of it home. But there comes a point where you learn how to deal with it. The job I do is extremely hard. It's said, and I don't know statistically exactly, but I have heard it said that only 50% of the people in this world can do my job. And out of that 50% of the people, there's only a very, very small percentage of people who can actually deal with the stress and do the job and stand it.
Physically, you can be physically fit and you can be prepared for the physical stressors you may go through. Mentally, you may think you're prepared for everything and see something that you just didn't expect. So now you got to figure out how you're going to get through the mental aspect of what has just happened to you.
Most people that have contact with law enforcement, it's either because they were a victim of a crime and they want to know, where were you? Why weren't you out protecting them when they were victimized? Or when they're stopped on traffic and then you hear, why aren't you out catching the bad guys?
Police officers come under pressure in call after call. This daily stress can make cops more vulnerable to traumatic incidents and life's routine challenges. The breakdown is often not recognized. Neither the officer, his family, or friends is aware of it. Police work affects an officer's personal life, especially his family, and his personal life affects his job performance. The public also plays a part.
What's the key to a police officer's emotional survival?
Well, we've touched on some of that. I believe that getting the right people for the job is number one, and then adequate support and supervision of that individual as he or she progresses through the job, and then having an emphasis on asking for help when you need it and knowing where to go for that help, keeping balance in your life, avoiding unhealthy practices in all areas of a life, and making changes as you grow and develop in your career.
We've had some rather high-profile incidents in Tucson over the last 12 months or so. The media covered them and covered them and covered them. Aside from the trauma that the officers no doubt felt as a result of being involved in the incident, whether it was a mass gathering on 4th Avenue or whether it involved an officer shooting suicide, the effects of that, beyond that, again, from the coverage and the scrutiny, what sorts of effect does that have on TPD, an organization like TPD as a whole, not just on the officers directly involved, but on the force as a whole?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that as an organization, certainly in my department, when we find out something we could have done better, we want to know about it and do it better the next time. And I think that's a philosophy that goes throughout the organization. So getting called on mistakes, I think, is something that, as grown-ups, anybody would expect. On the other hand, there is some morale that can suffer when the coverage is relentless and inaccurate. And that is something that the longer I'm in a police department, I have my own ways of dealing with it. And as an organization, I think we just realize that those things are going to happen and try to keep doing the best job we can.
In the public's view, the media is there, modern technology, I mean, everybody gets the news right now instead of 2 weeks from today. So it's difficult to try to be doing the right things, always within the back of your mind that there's somebody watching. Make sure you do the right thing.
It really troubles me to see the media report things in such a manner that makes the police look bad. And sometimes rightfully so, but many times I see police officers getting criticized or made to look bad in the media when in reality it was the furthest thing from the truth. And that really gives me a bad feeling toward the media when I see those things occur. Is that stressful for me? It is, because I see the community watching that and then looking at me in the patrol car at the intersection, and that I'm the person that the media's been criticizing, and I'm less than admirable, and it bothers me.
I wish the public had a better understanding of what our challenges are for the Tucson Police Department. We take on an average we dispatch on an average over 1,000 calls a day. That means that 1,000 calls are entered for an officer to go out, respond to someone's house. We only have X amount of officers working on a daily basis. We only have so many people answering the phones.
Is there a role for the public in helping deal with the kinds of stress and pressure that law enforcement officials come under?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a two-way street. I think that the public has to accept that the police are part of their community, and the police have to accept that the public is part of their community. It has to be a two-way street. And I think many agencies in community policing are doing this. But I also think communities have to not be willing to tolerate inappropriate police behavior. I think they have to hold police to that higher standard that we talked about. And too often, good citizens are willing to say, well, as long as they're doing it to those people, it's okay. They're not doing it in my neighborhood. You know, those people that are a threat to me. And I think when communities surrender control of their police department, I think that police department's at risk.
You know, there's a great deal that the public can do. And the public can write letters saying thank you when there is a good intervention that perhaps we catch the bad guy, or somebody gets helped in a traffic situation. By writing letters to the department, by writing letters to the newspaper, by writing letters to the officer and saying thank you, or by calling up and expressing appreciation for what goes on.
Study after study shows that it's not a lowering of standards that police officers want. They don't want trash in their ranks. They want people who meet their standards, and they want people who will meet the ethical view of the job that they possess. So I think the community has an obligation to hold police to a higher standard, to not make excuses for them, yet at the same time to understand why there were 4 police officers at that traffic stop. Because that police officer is dealing with an unknown. It's a big question mark that could be potentially lethal. The public doesn't understand that unless they've been in the shoes of a police officer. So I think they can learn to become educated as to how a police officer views the world, yet at the same time not lower the standard that they hold that police officer to.
Try to get information from we have our PIOs, or from people that they know that can give them information, or educate them on why the police do what they do.
I think the most challenging thing is getting people to realize that we're their neighbors, we're family. You know, we have kids and wives, and we're just like they are. We just have a different job, and getting them to support us. And I think that I find that difficult sometimes because, again, we're not always called when things are going well. We're called when things are going bad in a lot of cases.
I just wish people would remember that we're human beings on the other end of the phone. That we're just like they are. We have feelings like they do. And that they would consider the fact and remember that we're there trying to help them. We're not the enemy.
Staying emotionally fit requires a commitment to take care of yourself. It's not an easy task. And the greater the stress, the greater the task. For the typical police officer or public safety worker, the hardest part of staying healthy is to recognize a problem when it occurs. The next biggest hurdle to overcome is to seek help. Sometimes, for those whose careers are centered on helping others, the hardest thing to do is to accept help. A more tolerant and understanding general public and news media could also reduce some of the pressure that's a part of every workday of our law enforcement and public safety officers. Because, as we've learned tonight, in the final analysis, cops, just like the rest of us, are human.
Police officers are just regular people who have families and children that they go home to every day, and that they have to take care of and support and love, and just having that understanding that they're regular people that have feelings, and, you know, although they may not seem like it at times.
When I go to work, I wonder if this is the day that I'm not coming home. And I'm not paranoid about it, and I'm not worried that I'm gonna get into something and get hurt, but I always, in the back of my mind, I wonder, is today the day that my number's up, that something's going to happen where they're going to come after me? And fortunately, that day hasn't come, and hopefully it won't.
What is a cop? That question was asked and answered in a poem by Conrad Jensen that I found while surfing the internet recently. To paraphrase Jensen, cops come in both sexes and in all sizes. In spite of the fact that you can't find one when you want one, they're usually there when it counts the most. Cops deliver lectures, babies, and bad news. They work split shifts, Sundays and holidays. They see more misery, grief, and bloodshed than almost anyone, and yet they continue to hope for a better world. They like days off, vacations, coffee, and yes, donuts. Cops don't like drunk drivers, family fights, and anonymous letters. They must be impartial and courteous, even when some ingrate reminds them, I am a taxpayer, I pay your salary. Cops get medals for saving lives and shooting it out with the bad guys. Sometimes their widow accepts the medal. But the biggest reward often comes after some small kindness or service rendered, when the police officer feels a warm hand clasp and looks into grateful eyes and hears, thank you, and may God bless you. For Fox 11, I'm Bob Lee.